We're very excited to be able to talk a little bit about the new genetics paper that we've published from the SCAD research, which has been supported by SCAD, the British Heart Foundation, and the NIHR Biomedical Research Centre, and the NIHR Rare Diseases Translational Collaboration, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it's important to say all of the people that support it. And of course, the SCAD survivors. And a huge thank you also to a large number of completely healthy people who've come to help us and be controls. So those are all the thank yous. So what does it show? Well, what it shows is what we've identified is the first gene which we know we have demonstrated now to be a risk factor for SCAD. This is a gene which we call PHACTR1, P-H-A-C-T-R1, deeply unmemorable, but that's the name of the gene where this little variation in the DNA occurs. So let me try and explain what it is that we're looking at. So obviously the DNA itself is an enormous thing, and it has lots and lots of different genes that are coded in different places along the DNA. There are coding bits, and then there are non-coding bits, and those non-coding bits also have important functions. And the area that we've been looking at is actually in a non-coding part of the DNA. And what it probably does is it probably acts as a regulator for genes that are close by. And there are two genes that are close by which may be important. Probably the most relevant one is the PHACTR1 gene, which is the nearest one. But there's another gene that's quite close by, which is called endothelin. And endothelin is a gene which encodes something which we know is very important for blood vessels and for the management of blood pressure. So what we've found is that at this particular place in the DNA, in the populations, that's everybody in the world, this is a place where there is a variation. So some patients will have one type and the other patients will have another type. So one lot of patients will have an A type and one lot of patients will have a G type. And what we found is that those patients who have the A type have a higher risk of developing SCAD. And in fact, part of the reason that we looked at this particular place was because it had already been identified that this particular variation was associated with an increased risk of fibromuscular dysplasia, which we know occurs in some SCAD patients. Carotid dissections, which obviously are related again condition, and interestingly migraine, which is something that we see in a lot of SCAD survivors. Again, quite interestingly, this is also the site of the same variation has been found in, if you like, conventional heart attacks. I call them atherosclerotic ones, the ones associated with abnormal cholesterol and inflammation and that kind of thing. It's also been associated with normal heart attacks, but actually the risk is in the other direction. So for normal heart attacks, it's the G group that have the slightly increased risk. So as with a lot of things, it's quite a complex picture, but this variation in the DNA at this site is something which significantly associates with SCAD. What does that mean for a person? So what it means for a patient with SCAD, and this is very important, we know that for the most part, SCAD is not what we say familial. It doesn't usually run in families. There are small numbers of patients. We have a small number of sisters or mother-daughters mostly, because of course SCAD is a condition which affects more women than men. But they are rare. Most patients who have SCAD, it's what we say, it's sporadic. It just happens out of the blue. It's not something that runs in your family. It's just that you are affected by it. This gene is not something that we would be worried is something that runs in families. So if you have the gene and your child has this gene, that they are definitely going to have SCAD or something like that, like some inherited conditions. It should be thought of more as a risk factor. So for example, we all know that smoking cigarettes increases your risk of having a heart attack, for example, a normal, a standard heart attack. But we also know that not all people that smoke will have a heart attack, and likewise, not all people who don't smoke will not have a heart attack, if that makes sense. And the same is true with this risk variant, the PHACTR1 variant that I've described to you. It increases the risk of having SCAD, but it's not something that, because it's common in the population, it's not something that we would suggest is something that would run in families that you would need to look at in that way. So why all the excitement? Well, the reason this is exciting is, first of all, because it's a very strong association. The second is that it fits what we already know about the disease. Fits in with the association with FMD, fits in with the association with migraine carotid dissection, also fits, perhaps to a lesser extent, there will be lots of other variants which contribute to risk, but it also, the fact that it works the other way for conventional heart attacks and atherosclerotic vascular disease, also again sort of fits the pattern, if you like, of what we see in SCAD survivors. So what it does for us is it gives us a first insight into the, if you like, the underlying mechanisms. What's happening, if you like, at the genetic level, at the cell level, in terms of what determines the processes, if you like, that lead to SCAD. So it's giving us, if you like, some first clues as to the, if you like, the way that the research should perhaps go going forward. Now, clearly we want, and we will be working with our partners and friends in the Mayo Clinic in Paris and around the world to find the other genes that are associated with SCAD and working together to look at those. And there may be other common variants like PHACTR1, things that are common in the population but confer risk. And there may be some rare variants, things which only occur in a few patients, but if you like, in them are very important. And clearly that's one of the next steps, but also teasing out exactly what PHACTR1 does and why it confers this risk could be really important, not just for SCAD, but for all of these other conditions with which it's associated. And it certainly shows you that this gene is an important one in terms of SCAD and its related conditions. The way to think about it is this. What we've also learned in a sense about SCAD over the last few years is that for most patients, the genetics of SCAD, if you like, isn't going to be a simple single gene answer. So it's not going to be that all patients with SCAD have this gene which runs, strongly in families and is the cause of SCAD. SCAD is probably, and FMD are probably conditions which are polygenetic. That means there are lots of genes which have a play. And probably of those, PHACTR1 is the most important one. In heart attacks, we also know that there are lots of genes now that have been identified as, if you like, giving part of the profile of the risk of heart attack. They're not the only things that confer risk. We've talked about smoking, we know about blood pressure and other things that are also important risk factors for conventional myocardial infarction. So this gene in conventional myocardial infarction, if you like, the variant that's associated with SCAD is slightly protective, but it's not the whole story by any means. As I've said, this is not the sort of gene that we would want to do family screening to find out about, because it's common. So we would find it in lots of people, but it's conferring a risk profile. So at the moment, outside that very small group of SCAD survivors who have what we call hereditary connective tissue disorders, those are people that have signs and features of Marfan syndrome or vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, these sort of rarities that a very small number of SCAD patients have. Outside those groups where genetic testing may be useful for family screening and things, for the vast majority of SCAD patients, genetic screening at the moment is not necessary. Now clearly things are going to keep moving, and I mentioned a little bit earlier about the rare variants and the common variants. At the moment we've got the common variant, the first one that we've identified, and there will be lots of interest in these rare variants and these very rare or unusual SCAD cases that do run in families. And I think we'll probably find that we learn and get a much clearer picture of how genes work in SCAD as a whole from this combined approach of trying to understand the common variants, the genes that confer risk, and the rare variants, the genes that are very important but only in a small number of people. At the moment, it isn't necessary to have a genetic screening either as a SCAD survivor yourself or for your family. So not yet is the answer. You're absolutely right to identify the fact that SCAD is less common in men, and as a result of that, accumulating information, including on the role of different genetic elements in men who have SCAD, will take longer, because you just need to build up the numbers of patients to be able to understand that. So I think we do have to add that caveat at the moment. And again, I think hopefully everybody who's associated with beat SCAD will be aware that there's a particular focus at the moment on the research study on looking and characterising SCAD in those men within the SCAD survivor community, and we're sort of just building up our knowledge of those, and I think that again is the way to go. As with anything, we have to get the answers. You know, some of the answers will come more slowly than others. But, you know, obviously a big step forward with this first gene. So I think at the moment we have to be cautious about attributing the finding of PHACTR1 to endothelin with any certainty. We know that the variant at PHACTR1 does seem to alter the amount of endothelin in the blood, and that could be important. But what we haven't seen at the moment is that the level of endothelin associates with SCAD as opposed to healthy volunteers. So I think at the moment for the endothelin, we know that's a vascular reactive thing, so it's very easy to get excited and back that as the thing that's causative. But I think we should be cautious about that at the moment. So I think for the time being, what we should say is that we have a gene. We think it's a regulatory element of DNA. We're not quite sure how it works, but it does seem to be important in a, if you like, a whole range of illnesses which affect blood vessels. So I think that there will be lots of interest, not just in the SCAD community, but more broadly in PHACTR1 and what it does to blood vessels and how that confers or modifies risk. And in some respects, this is quite good news for SCAD, because it has this protective effect in conventional vascular disease. There will be lots of groups that are interested in working out what it does. So I think you know, we will certainly be interested, and so will others. And you know, we'll be watching that space over the coming months and years as we try to learn what this does. And just finally, I want to say a big thank you to the collaborators who helped us on this research project. So as with any condition that involves a less common disease, being able to build up all of those samples of DNA from patients, if we just worked with the beat SCAD community and the UK SCAD patients, would have taken us a long time. And it's because of the collaboration with our friends at the Mayo Clinic in the US, in New York, Australia, and very prominently in Paris, that we've been able, if you like, to accelerate this genetic study to, if you like, get an answer much faster. So we'd like to, if you like, extend a big thank you to them.